Hi, I'm Andy Moore.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
See, we can talk for us.
Assistant Director at the Library. Thank you all for forsaking the Red Sox and braving the weather. As the Boston Globe pointed out a few years ago, it may have taken Jenna Blum 5 tries to get into Boston University's graduate writing program, but it only took her 1 novel, Those Who Save Us, to land on the New York Times bestselling list. About her next best-selling novel, The Storm Chasers, Publishers Weekly said, Blum renders the stormy backdrop as richly as she does her nuanced characters. Jenna Blum has taught novel and fictional workshops at Grove Street Writers in Boston since its founding in 1997, and was the fiction editor for Agni Literary Magazine. She is also a public speaker and avid cook who creates and tests all the recipes in her novels. She's here tonight with her newest novel, The Lost People magazine, called An Exquisite Page Turner. Please welcome Jenna Blum.
Thank you for that very enthusiastic applause. That was great. And yes, thank you for, I know there's some stiff competition tonight, for your attention. I have a sort of a missing plug-in in my head where the sports should be. So I don't know about things like the football and the baseball, but my fiance told me, you know, the Sox are in the World Series, so you're probably going to have to expect some competition for your evening readings this fall. So thanks, you guys. And also, I know, as we were just talking about, the weather was a little wacky. So we can talk about that. We can talk about anything you want. Like, I actually like having an intimate group because we can chat about whatever. So what I'll do then is sort of introduce the novel and give you my spiel about why I wrote it, because that's what people always want to know, because I did sort of a million times. Couldn't I go out and get cooked dinner somewhere? I can read to you a little bit, a scene that Dick has not heard before, so it's something brand new that I've never read to anybody. And then we can just chat about stuff, novelist stuff, or writing stuff, or just stuff. I make up all answers and answer all questions, so it's all good to me. So, Lost Family, how many of you have read my new? You have? So like half the room actually has done homework, which is pretty, or like, a third of the room has done homework and is continuing to do it. So my agent always says, get your product placement in. She's French, so this is my product placement. This is my 3rd book baby, and it's about a German Jewish concentration camp survivor named Peter Rashkin, who emigrates to the States after the war and starts this iconic restaurant on the Upper East Side called Masha's, the menus for which are actually in the novel. My publisher very obligingly laid out these gorgeous menus from the items that I sent them sort of as a list. And I did kitchen test every single one of them. I made up all the recipes. So Peter starts this restaurant called Masha's in New York, on which all of these menu items are an homage to the wife, Masha, he lost during the war. And into Peter's restaurant one night walks this young supermodel named June Bouquet, who's an immigrant from the Midwest where her last name is pronounced Bucket, so she doesn't know that there's anything weird about her name until people in New York are like, June Bouquet, really? And Peter, despite his better instincts, is smitten, even though he maintained that he would never be involved with a woman ever again after losing his wife and twin toddlers during the war. So that's Peter's conundrum. He carries the first third of the novel in 1965 when he and June are carrying on this very passionate courtship about which Peter is extremely ambivalent. And then his wife, June, which is not a spoiler because it's on the flyleaf, gets the second third of the novel in 1975, and you get her perspective and her voice on what it's like to be married to a trauma survivor. And their daughter, Elsbeth, who may or may not be me, but who is definitely a hot mess, comes of age in 1985 and gives us her perspective on her parents' marriage and what her own reaction is to not being able to reach her dad and to having a really troubled mom. So the book is kind of structurally a 3-ring circus, and that's how I like to think of it. And people always ask me, why did you write this novel? I wrote this because I used to interview Holocaust survivors for the Steven Spielberg Survivors of the Shoah Foundation in the late 90s when I lived in Minnesota. A lot of survivors in Golden Valley and Edina, the suburbs of Minneapolis, who knew that there were even Jews there, but there were. And a lot of them were survivors. And I must have interviewed over 60 survivors because I was very young when I was interviewing, and the foundation said to me, you have stamina, so we're going to put you to work interviewing survivor couples. So these were spouses who had met in the camps overseas, in displaced persons camps, in the forests as partisans, or in the States after the war, and I would interview one spouse in the morning and the other spouse in the afternoon. And it was so striking to me that in so many cases, the spouses did not know the particulars of each other's stories. They knew, of course, that they were each survivors and what camps they had been in, like what the basic shapes were of the families they had lost. But so many of the details they kept to themselves until the foundation came along and implored them to give testimony so that we could store it and combat revisionists who said that the Holocaust never happened. So for the first time in 50 years, some of these people were opening up. And one of the survivors I interviewed, I never used any of the stories verbatim because they don't belong to me, but one of the survivors inspired part of Peter's story and helped me create him. So the real survivor, like Peter, was a chef. Although Peter, in the novel, when he's in Berlin, his native Berlin, is an aspiring chef because he's such a young man. The actual survivor was a very famous chef before the war. He was like the Anthony Bourdain of Prague. And then the Nazis came, and his business, his livelihood, his life were all destroyed. They put him through several camps. He survived them all, emigrated to the States. The only job he could get was as a busboy at the Lincoln Dell, actually.
Oh, really?
I'm throwing out all these Minnesota references because we both are really well. And then he was fired from that job because his tattoo from Auschwitz upset the diners who didn't want to know about what had happened. And the survivor who told me the story sort of tossed it off anecdotally toward the end of his testimony, and compared to everything else he had told me, it didn't sound that extreme. But I remembered that weird little story always, because I thought, what a strange irony it was to make it to this country after having endured things that we can't even imagine, and think that you were safe, and then find yourself totally isolated by not being able to convey to anybody what had happened to you, even if they wanted to know. And a lot of the time, they didn't want to know, even if they were American Jews. So I started thinking about what I didn't focus on as much during the interviews. Mostly we focused on survivors' lives before the war and asking about their families who had all been wiped out and their villages, which had all been vaporized, asking about the war years. And then we would spend, half an hour on what was your life like after you emigrated to the States. And the assumption, I think, even for me was, it was like a happy ending, right? You could scroll the credits, there would be like bouncy music because you had made it through the worst and now you're in America and everything is great. And survivors indeed got jobs, started families, and children, great-grandchildren. But I thought, it couldn't have been that easy always. And this man's story made me think what it would be like to be a young man coming to this country, having lost your immediate family, your extended family, all of your friends, and in Peter's case, a young wife and children, and then having to start all over again in this landscape where you didn't even speak the language, where you had to sort of intuit the language from radio and movies until you learned to speak to other people. I thought it must have been a strange, mute, miserable existence for a while. And so I started working with Peter's character. I wrote a novella about him in this anthology called Grand Central, which Dick has, in which all the stories were set in Grand Central Station on the same day in 1945 when America is coming home from the war. And my contribution was Peter getting fired from the oyster bar because of his tattoo. So that was what I airlifted from the survivor. And then wandering through the terminal until he gets to the tracks and tries to jump off because he wants to join his wife and 2 daughters and then he can't. At the last minute, the train is coming, and his legs vapor lock, and he can't jump onto the tracks. That was the end of the story. And by the way, the subtitle for Grand Central is Original Stories of Post-War Love and Reunion, and then there was like my stories, and people on Amazon are like, who is this woman and how did she get into this anthology? So poor Peter is the only really dark story in there. But everywhere I went with that book, when we were touring, people said, what happened to this man? Like, we can't just leave him by the side of the tracks in Grand Central. We really care about him. We want to know how his life turns out. Does he overcome missing his wife and daughters? Can he start over again? So I started working on his story, and in the middle of that, I was in Florida at a reading, and somebody said, what are you working on next? And I told them I'm trying to expand Peter's life from this novella. And after the signing, after the reading I was signing, and a lady came up to me, and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, I'm so glad you're writing about this man's experience, but I also beg you to think about his American family. She said, my husband's father is a survivor, and we revere him, we love him, and he's totally emotionally shut down, and my husband has suffered his whole life because he's never been able to reach his father, and his father has never talked about what happened to him in the camps. So my husband has only, the biggest idea of what he went through, which in some ways is worse than knowing. And she said it's taken a toll on me, on our children, on him. So I implore you to write about the survivor's family. And I felt like the universe had given me a little God wink to do that, because I was already thinking, whenever I sat down to write about Peter and expanding his story, I kept seeing his daughter walking around in my head as a teenager, and his daughter kind of acting out the way teenagers do when they can't get their parents' attention and they have a lot of love and a lot of anger. Of course, a 15-year-old girl is going to direct it at the wrong man. Not that I ever did that, or that anybody here ever did that, but that's what Peter's daughter was doing in my imagination, and I also knew that his wife, his second wife, would be very frustrated by having this elegant, charming husband who is closed as a clam whenever she brings up anything emotional. Mm-hmm. So I started with this reader's blessing, working on June and Elsbeth's stories, and the novel, which started by asking the question, can you really start over again after something so awful and life-warping? Like, is that really possible, or do you always carry the memories of that early chapter with you throughout your life? It expanded into, how does a whole family react to one person's, one member's trauma and PTSD? So how does it feel to be the wife of a man you love who is not accessible to you? And how does it feel to be a daddy's girl and love your dad who you know loves you, but you know also is locked in his own mind with his first wife and his other two daughters, who you think must be better than you because you know he's always with them in some way. So that's what the Lost Family is about. That's the short explanation. So I'm not really capable of short explanations or answers. You are forewarned. And I think what I would like to do is read. I'm going to read something brand new to entertain Dick. So you can tell me. You can then tell me. You can like sort of rank the scenes that I read, and you can let me know which ones you like the best. Oh my gosh, these glasses have a spot on them. So I'm finally getting used to wearing these glasses. I got them originally because I thought they were cute, and my fiance thought they were cute and used to sort of chase me around the house when I was wearing them, but now I need them to actually see and read. And last night I was in, yesterday I was in Charlotte, North Carolina reading, and I had short arm syndrome when I had to sort of read like that. So tonight I actually remember them, so that's good. So this scene is from Peter's section of the book in 1965. And he has just brought June, his paramour, to Larchmont, New York, and introduced her to his only surviving relatives, Saul and Ruth. Saul is a very wealthy New York Jewish lawyer. He was born and raised in New York, and he is what he would call himself a big macher, like a big man. Saul, like my grandfather, was born the son of a plumber on the Lower East Side and raised himself up to being a Madison Avenue lawyer. So he has the right to call himself a big macher, and he also is a great philanthropist and a patron of the arts. And when he drinks Cutty Sark, a total bully, which was exactly what my grandfather was like. And it was really instructive for me to put him into a novel and kind of explore that contradiction, how somebody who was so generous with his family and with other people could then sort of turn into such a bullying character behind closed doors.
How old are Peter and June at this point?
Oh, great question. Peter is, let's see, this is 1965, he was born in 20, so he's 45. And June is 25, and she's 20 years younger than he is, which he sees nothing unusual about because, you know, it's 1965 and she's cute and there she is. So. But in fact, when Peter first sees June in his restaurant, he realizes that he's playing this game that he's been playing ever since his wife and daughters died, which is it maybe my wife who's come back? Like, how old is this woman? Is she maybe one of my daughters? And then he ascertains that June is actually like safely out of the range of his daughters, what age his daughters would have been by now. But it's a game he plays more and more frequently as the book continues, much to his dismay. So Peter is brought June up to meet Saul and his lovely and sort of put upon wife, Ruth, for Thanksgiving. Things have gone dreadfully wrong, of course, because they want Peter to marry again a nice Jewish girl, and June is a shiksa from the Midwest, from Minnesota, from rural Minnesota, in fact. And after the Thanksgiving lunch at which things had gone so awry, Ruth, Peter's cousin's wife, has taken June aside and told her a little secret that nobody in New York knows about except Saul and Ruth, which is that Peter also had these two daughters who died, not just the wife, Masha, whose name is on his restaurant. Nobody knows about these little girls, and Peter has kept them a secret because he cannot bear to think about them. So when June comes to him and says, "You had daughters? You didn't tell me you had daughters," this is what happens. So he's taking her for a walk down to the Long Island Sound to get out of the house, away from his relatives, clear his head, and he's just in sort of an interior panic because now somebody else knows about these little girls. Let's see. Okay, and the daughters' names are Vivian, Vivi, and Ginger, which is in here. Yes. Okay. Peter sat down on the bench on the platform at the end of the dock by the Sound. He felt weak and a little nauseous. He passed a palm over his face. It came away damp. Gulls cawed and buoys clanged out in the water. "I am sorry you had to find out in such a way," he said. "It must have been a shock." "Yes," June agreed. "Ruth showed me the picture of the little girls. It's the only picture left," she said. "She thought I might want to know what they looked like." Peter made a small noise as if somebody had punched him in the stomach. "Please don't be mad at her, Pete," said June. "I genuinely think she thought I already knew." Peter snorted. "I doubt that. She knows I never discuss the girls." "Well, maybe," June said tartly. "Ruth thought we were serious enough for you to have told me." She lit a cigarette without waiting for Peter's lighter, the sulfur smell of the match sharp in the wind. Peter got up and walked to the railing, his fists balled in his pockets. He looked at the shoreline opposite, the houses there with their own docks and boats, at the line gray upon gray where the Sound emptied into the open ocean. "June," he said, "please understand. It has nothing to do with whether we are serious or not serious. I do care for you very much, but I will not discuss them with anyone." "Yes, I'm starting to get the message," said June. After a moment, she said, "They were beautiful. Twins?" "Yes." Vivian and Ginger, Peter thought, and would have told June, but speaking their names aloud hurt too much. His double miracle, his pair of golden coins, his daughters, Vivi and Gigi. Named by his first wife, Masha, of course. Masha, with her unquenchable penchant for films and their stars, so pronounced that on a couple of occasions she had almost lost her job in the hotel over it, had quite forgotten herself, and snuck into the Hotel Adlon's dining room from the kitchen to peer at some of the more famous patrons from behind the mirrored columns. Petal, it was Clark Gable. No one else is as dashing except you. I could tell it was Clark by his mustache and his smile. What a rascal. And do you know they say he has false teeth? Or, Marlene Dietrich, I swear it was her, Petal. What other woman wears a tuxedo and such eyebrows? Masha, who never bought clothes, whose dresses had holes in them, and whose soles flapped right off her shoes, but who saved every pfennig for matinees, at least until the signs appeared in theaters, Juden verboten. Then she would no longer attend the theater, in solidarity with Peter, although with her perfect Aryan lineage, Masha certainly could have gone. Magazines are good enough for me, she said with a sniff, and it's so stupid, ironic, keeping you out when you're the one who looks like a movie star. Masha, with her long Modigliani face and straw-white hair, no pretensions toward vanity herself, but obsessed with Vivian Leigh's cat-slanted eyes and Ginger Rogers' dazzling long legs, gams, Masha called them, pronouncing the slang with a careful American accent. Hence the names of their girls Vivian and Ginger, born into the dark year 1940, a total surprise and a terror to their young parents, who were barely into their 20s themselves. Look, June, Peter said, there is one thing you must know about me if we are to continue. He heard how clipped his accent had grown in his upset, but he couldn't help it. I will not talk about them, he said. June finished her cigarette without answering, and when she was done, she stamped out the butt and put it in her leather jacket pocket rather than cast it into the water. She joined Peter at the railing, all red and gold glory in the gray afternoon. The wind-streaked water from the corner of her eye, or maybe a tear back toward her temple. Ordinarily, Peter might have lifted his thumb to brush it away. I will not, he repeated. Do you understand? June nodded. She heaved a sigh. Peter, I'm kind of scared to say this, but I'm going to anyway. I really like you. In fact, I think I'm falling for you. But I think, and here she mocked his formal cadence, giving Peter a little smile, if we are to continue, you should see somebody professional, an analyst. I'd be nervous to get more involved otherwise. Do you know what I mean? Peter looked down at the dark water, at the flotsam bobbing and swirling around the pilings, seaweed, foam, styrofoam, murk. I do, he said. But will you go see an analyst? Peter sighed. It was such an American idea, not analysis itself, for which the Austrian Freud had been responsible, but this optimism, this idea that lying on a couch 50 minutes a week and talking about one's dreams and troubles would solve anything. Peter had tried therapy during his second year in America, when the sleepwalking had begun, when he had wandered about Saul and Ruth's house every night, waking in odd places like on the piano bench or in the basement without any idea of how he'd gotten there, on a couple of occasions, most disconcertingly, without knowing who he was. He had literally forgotten his own name. Saul's doctor had said these episodes would conclude on their own once Peter had recovered from malnourishment and shock and moved farther away in time from the war. But when Peter had been found standing chest deep in the pool one morning, terrifying Ruth when she looked out the window, Saul had had the doctor recommend a guy. That's all he is, Saul said, just a guy, just go and see him. And indeed the guy was just a guy, a middle-aged gentleman with wire spectacles and a mole on his nose that very much bothered Peter, but that he didn't mention because he was sure this would say something damning about his psyche. Peter had lain on the scratchy orange sofa in the analyst's office beneath a black and purple reproduction Rothko, listening to the traffic outside on 57th Street and the suck and burble of the analyst's pipe, and he waited for the analyst to say something, and the analyst waited for Peter to say something, until one day, in the middle of their fourth session, Peter heard a snore and realized the analyst was fast asleep. He had gotten up and walked out. But here was June, and if Peter had told the truth when he had said he would not talk about his daughters, he had also been honest about his caring for her. And so, forgiving himself in advance for telling a lie, he said, if this is what it takes to keep you June Bouquet, I will see an analyst. So, Peter's conflict is fairly pronounced in that scene. He has a lot of struggles and a lot of the past coming back, and the more involved he gets with June, the more his past bubbles up and sort of forms a noose around his neck. So it's a terrible place he's sort of caught in.
Do you think the trauma of surviving the Holocaust is, well, it's certainly unique, but do you think that you could have used, and I'm not saying you should have, but I'm just wondering, I know this comes out of your experience, and so you work with what you got, but would somebody who had undergone maybe the loss of his wife and daughters and been murdered by in their home, home invasion or something, would that have made the character sufficiently traumatized for your purposes? Or
my Machiavellian purposes,
that's right, yeah.
Inflict terrible things on
or is
my
there something
characters.
so particularly awful about the Holocaust, about the institutional aspect of it, that gives it a dimension that nothing else could approach that you would need?
That's a great question. I mean, it's hard to say because different people react to trauma differently, and of course the loss of one's family, and especially I think children, is the worst possible thing a person can endure. I think it's interesting, I've been reading a book called Survivor Cafe, The Legacy of Trauma and the Labyrinth of Memory by Elizabeth Rossner, who is the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. And so she's sort of exploring the same question, like the degree of her parents' PTSD and trauma, which manifests for each parent in radically different ways. Her dad experiences it physically, and her mom has like various phobias and hoarding activities and sort of amasses jewelry that's both real and not real and hides it all over the house, and they both have weird food things. She thinks that may be particular to their experiences in the Holocaust, and those are both individuated also. Like her mom was a hidden child survivor and her dad was in the camps. So I think what she's exploring is that trauma is trauma is trauma. So you're going to be afflicted by some cellular level memory of trauma, whatever that trauma happens to be. And she likens the Holocaust in her study to survivors of Rwanda, for instance, or survivors of Hiroshima, these giant cataclysms that affect society for years and years. I think when I think about the cases of survivors who are in the camps, as you beautifully put it, the institutionalization of that trauma and the length of the trauma, and also the sort of unimaginable, like pre-Holocaust, unimaginable things that people had to see, like putting people in ovens and burning them. Like, who does that outside of fairy tales? Well, the Nazis did. So I think some of the things that people saw were so atrocious, and they had to endure them on a daily basis for 5, 6, 7 years, that I can't imagine that any of them ever came out and did anything ever again. I mean, it's astonishing to me that they did. So I think that there are sort of degrees of trauma, and then individuals intersect with those various situations and come out of it dealing in their own ways. Like some survivors, in my experience, became sort of professional speakers and went to libraries and universities and synagogues talking about what they had gone through and educating people about it, but most of them locked it away completely in another chapter, in another life, so that they could start over again because they just couldn't bear to think about it. So I think that's a commonality among all groups of survivors, trauma survivors, no matter what, is that memory becomes very tricky to access and to express. It's a great question.
Why did you choose New York?
Oh, that's a great question. I chose New York. This is my New York novel after one Minnesotan / German novel and one like Minnesotan American novel. I was born in New York, like Elsbeth in the book Mount Sinai, and lived in her apartment on 96th Street, East 96th Street. My parents were, they met in New York and courted in New York, so their courtship story is very much in the novel. My dad was not a chef or a survivor, but he was a news writer for CBS at the time that my mom met him. And she was not a model, she was a pianist who came to the city from her tiny Minnesota town on a Juilliard scholarship, and then met this dashing older man, and was bedazzled by my dad. My dad was very charming and lovely and elegant, a lot like Peter, very, very smart, and a very gentle soul. But my mom ran headfirst into the wall of his family's Judaism, like a cultural Judaism, which she didn't understand or like very much. She didn't have any knowledge of it from being in Minnesota. So there were no Jews in my mom's hometown, to the point that when she brought my dad home for the first time, people were like, oh, okay, so all Jews wear sweater vests because he's wearing a sweater vest. So it was sort of like watch him to see what he did. And so when he went to the local cafe and had a grilled cheese with tomatoes, they were like, oh, Jews eat grilled cheese with tomatoes. That must be a kosher thing. So it was a very different culture that she came from and then had to get acclimated to. And then my dad's parents, who are Saul and Ruth in the book, called her the shiksa. So there wasn't a lot of love lost there and a big culture clash. So I explored all of this because I grew up immersed in it, and I thought it was so rich and interesting to sort of be an immigrant within your own country and what that means. And I have a great love for New York because of being born there, and I grew up in New Jersey, so I went into New York every weekend, first to see my grandparents, and then to go to shows, and later to get my braces on, and then to get my braces off, and I just have a great love affair with the city, so it was fun to pay homage to it in this book. New York changes in the decades in this novel too, so we get 65 New York with its sort of tumultuous political atmosphere, but it's also very Mad Men, so everybody looks very glamorous and all the food is brown and saturated in whiskey and everybody goes to nightclubs, so that was great. And then in 1975 there's a sort of polemical divide about Vietnam that shows up in the novel, and in 1985, which is Elsbeth's section, she gets involved with a young photographer who's the toast of the art world because his specialty is shooting naked preteens, so he's also very controversial, and she is in love with him, and she learns about his New York, so the New York art scene in the 80s, which is incredibly debauched and very outsized in its character. And she also goes to all the nightclubs and stuff looking for her quarry, this photographer because she's so in love with. And she sees George Michael, and she's wearing these big petticoats and bustiers, and so it was fun to have the city itself shapeshift like that over time.
What do you do for research? How do you research the different eras?
Everything. I do everything for research pretty much. I always start by reading because my dad always said to me, Jen, if you don't know the answer, go look it up. It's in the library. So I still do that, although I'm sorry to say and also happy to say that I mostly buy my books now because I dog ear them and underline them and treat them badly and really get involved with my research books, so I wouldn't want to return them to the library in that state.
You wouldn't want them like that.
No, you would not want them like that. So I started out doing a lot of book research. I mean, for Lost Family, for instance, I would print out something like Wikipedia 1965, which is 25 pages of everything you'd want to know about 1965. I'd underline it just to get a sense of what books I needed to order and what books I needed to buy. Then I would read the books. I had image boards up all over my study, so I would Google 1965 images, 1965 clothes, restaurants, advertisements. Part of Peter's section is set in the Great Blackout in New York in 1965, so I had a lot of images of that. They were quite dark. And since his section is about a chef, I did a lot of restaurateur memoir reading and chef memoir reading, so starting with Anthony Bourdain, who I love, who I'm so sad left us, but who's such an amazing, he's just a great writer and a great voice. And I found, to my surprise and delight, that so many of the chefs were great storytellers, which made sense to me because their lives are all out of the box. They all have unusual lives, off the grid, off a regular schedule. They're involved in creating things that they're passionate about. So I read chef memoirs, I read cookbooks from 1965, I read cookbooks from Germany because Peter was born in Germany. My grandmother's, my Jewish grandma's recipes, I solicited from my aunt and read those. and I read the Betty Crocker New Picture Cookbook from 1965 over and over, and actually ordered Gourmet Magazine from 1965 the whole year on eBay. It had been like put into like a compendium, so I was like going through and sort of taking notes on the recipes. And then I invented the recipes for Masha's, so that was part of my research. It took a whole summer of like delightful procrastination to invent all of the recipes on the menu and to kitchen test them on my fiance. So I learned how to sort of cook this 1965 like haute cuisine. That was delightful. And my other eras, I did the same thing. So I would be listening to the music. I made Spotify playlists for each character, so I could be in the world of the book even when I wasn't writing. I would be listening to the music. Watched all the movies from the era, so my fiance got to watch Breakfast at Tiffany's, and then he had to watch everything from 1965, an old news broadcast, Walter Cronkite. 1985 I had the best time with because that was when I grew up, so I basically just went back and pillaged my high school experience and put my high school friends in the novel, and I actually dressed like June when I was writing her section in 1975, so I had like bell bottoms and clogs and a t-shirt that said feminist and a bandana that I would put on every day before I went into my study to write, so that Jim, my guy, was like, oh, I see that we're writing June today, and I'd be like, yeah man, peace out. And I had lists and lists also on the wall of slang from each era because it varied so much. So I really tried to get everything vintage and correct, and of course, after doing this for 3 years and having 6 proofreaders read the novel, including Dutch proofreaders, because the book came out in Holland before it came out here. My Dutch publisher bought it first. So I had a whole Dutch copy edit and a whole copy edit from HarperCollins, my American publisher, which means that they go through it with a fine-tooth comb and they say things like, oh, you know, you said that 4th of July in 1976 was on a Monday, but actually it was on a Tuesday, so we're gonna have to change that. I mean, it's that precise. Somehow, I missed June in 1965 is singing the lyrics from New York, New York on a train. She's humming it, and it wasn't written until 73. And you would not believe how many readers have written to me about this so far. I'm like, you guys, it's a 400-odd page book. Like, there has to be one mistake. So, yeah, so I try very hard to get the atmosphere of the book correct, like authentic, so that you, the reader, can walk into each world and each era and then come out of it with memories of that era. It's called method research, or insanity, depending on who's doing the speaking. So.
And what's the proportion of research to writing?
The proportion of research to writing could be like 100 to 1. If you, I mean, with the advent of the internet, you could pretty much go down the rabbit hole for days and days to research one line, which is, you know, not necessary, but it's fun. When I was writing Grand Central, for instance, which was set in 45, I found myself doing a lot of shopping on this website called ModCloth, which has like all of these vintage clothes. So I'm like, oh, I really need these 1945 pinafores to write in. And I'm like, that's research, like that's not actual research. So I have to set a limit. And my limit is gauged by when I feel like I can get into the virtual reality suit of the character's skin, whether it's Peter, June, or Elsbeth, and sort of put that on and move around in his or her world and know what smell I'm going to encounter in any scene, what things taste like, what they're going to eat, what their clothes are like, what they hear, what they're going to see, what they would say, what their slang would be. Once I have sort of a comfortable acquaintance with that experience, then I'm done with the research, and I don't really need to do more. And in fact, of course, you've probably all read books where people have done so much research that they're like, look at all my research, aren't you impressed? And then you sort of lose the story. Like, I never want that to happen in my novels. The story has to come first.
Then how much time, I was thinking also of time.
Yeah.
Time spent researching and then time writing.
That's a good question. Probably equal for me. I would do like 3 months of research for Peter, especially just to get into his restaurant, kind of build that from the ground up, because the restaurant became like a character to me. And then to chart out his story, and then to research all the incidents in his story, like what's going on in the backdrop of his story. That took about 3 months, and then it took me about 3 months to draft his 100 pages. And the same thing for the other characters. But what's different is that, so that's research and then actual draft writing, like first draft writing. But then to revise the novel takes like 2.5 years. So eventually, scale tips much more toward writing as opposed to research, and the writing kind of mushrooms and eclipses the research. Research starts to feel very distant, and then you're just trying to get the story right, like over and over again until hopefully it is.
And do you have readers as you write?
I do. I have 2 friends for this novel who were my accountability buddies. And I was in my family home in rural Minnesota when I was writing this book, because there's nothing else to do there except write, which is why I go there. And in the winter especially, it's like you're Jack Torrance doing like all work and everything, standing out of water. Which is actually great, but it can also be very isolating. So every day before I started writing, I had these 2 friends from Grub Street Writers here, where I teach, and we would send each other a description of what we hoped to accomplish that day, like what scene we were going to write, or what research we were going to do, or what have you. And then when we were done, we would send a 1-word email that said done. And I found out that once I had described what I was going to work on that day, it didn't seem so onerous. Like before that, I would feel very anxious about the sort of nebulous task of saying like, oh, I have to get Peter from point A to point B, or June is going to do this today, but I feel sort of, how am I going to make that happen? And then once I had said it in writing to my friends in a couple of sentences, I thought, I can do that. I can do that in a couple of hours. So.
And how do you make it happen? Well, I'm remembering a piece that Garrison Keillor wrote about when he was first starting to write. And he wrote stories in which he said, I had a lot of people standing around the room smoking cigarettes. And I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know how to get them from point A to point B.
Yeah, it's really
Do you have an outline?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
In my crazy looking study, amid the images and my terms of slang and post-its with lines on them, I also have an outline that I've written on sheets of typing paper, and then I've taped them together and then put them on the wall, and it runs from ceiling to floor, and that's usually like a whole book. And when I say an outline, I mean a laundry list of scenes. There are like 4 scenes per chapter, pretty much, and it's just a 1-line description, so it would be like, in which our hero discovers that, Saul has been using fundraising money to buy arms for Israel, which actually is a scene. And so there are a whole bunch of lines like that, just like a sort of laundry list. And then after I write the scene, I check it off, which is, to me, very satisfying, because I'm very OCD, and I'm one of those people who has lists everywhere. So as I go through revising the book, a lot of the scenes that I started with were sort of placeholders, because I need to get people from point A to point Z. So you're just throwing any old, thing on the wall. Like maybe June's mom can come for a visit. I have like 80 pages of courtship in here, and they can only have sex so much. So what am I going to do with them? They can't go to the restaurant all the time. And I try to vary my scenes so that you're not always in a restaurant, you're not always in a car, you're not always at a nightclub. I need to mix it up for you guys to keep it interesting, and yet organic to the characters. So it is actually the hardest thing in the book to plot it out, because you have to keep the action moving, and at the same time it can't feel contrived when you're reading it. It has to seem like it's expressing the character's emotional learning curve. So that's what takes the longest. So my scenes get crossed out and new ones come in, and those get crossed out and new ones come in, and I usually have about 5 or 6 outlines per book.
Wow.
Yeah.
5 or 6 floor to ceiling.
5 to 6 floor to ceiling. So every time I revise a book, I pin a new outline up over the old one.
Oh.
And then I do the same for like the 3rd and 4th. And by the last outline, there are no cross-outs on it, and it's like pristine. I'm like, there's the end outline. It's very exciting to me. So, but yeah, it's tough. And I teach the novel workshop at Grub Street, and I would say that 99% of the problems I see with novels in progress are structure, the plot. So if you're ever reading a book and it starts out great and then it falls off the shelf and you're like, oh my God, this is so boring, I don't know if I can finish this, it's because somewhere in there the writer had a lot of people standing around smoking cigarettes and couldn't figure out how to keep the action going. Or all the scenes are like in a submarine and you're always in the submarine for 145 pages or something. It's usually these strange sort of card tricks that writers have to do beneath the surface that hopefully you're not aware of at all when you're reading a book.
Since I was amazed by the research depth, were you very much involved with any particular restaurant? Or you spent a lot of time there, or?
That's a good question. Kind of like my own in my kitchen. I sort of like decided my kitchen was a restaurant. I was thinking about the Russian tea room a lot when I was creating Masha's. My parents loved the Russian tea room when they were living in New York and when they were dating, and the sort of red elegance of that place was what I was aspiring to for Masha's, but then I also needed to make Masha's its own thing, so I was recreating it like a German Jewish comfort food, haute cuisine menu. And I got to revisit a lot of the restaurants I loved in New York from my youth. So I was thinking about Lucite, which I went to like once, and the Rainbow Room, which I used to ask to go to on my birthdays, which appears in the novel also. And when I was a little girl, I had a restaurant in my basement called Faster, which was a fast food restaurant in which I imprisoned my parents and fed them like things made out of Play-Doh and like baked in my Easy Bake oven with its like 40-watt light bulb. And so for me, recreating the restaurant in the novel was like being a restaurateur, which is one of the best things about writing, is that it allows you to live alternate lives without actually having the talent to make those lives come true. So I did a lot of restaurant work in my life because I graduated from college with a bachelor's in English. So of course you immediately go into food service because that's like what you're qualified to do. But I knew from that, and being a prep chef and a sous chef and a waitress and a hostess, that I didn't have the creativity to be an actual chef. And my food tends to taste good but look weird. So if I had a restaurant, it would be called My Food Looks Good But Tastes Weird. And so it was great to actually project myself into the experience of a chef who actually is an excellent chef and live that experience through him in this restaurant that I made up that I love. And all the editors, when they were bidding on this book, when we took it out at auction, they were like, I really want to go to Masha's. They're like, I love the book, but I also just really want to go to eat at that restaurant. And I was like, honey, you gotta buy the book to eat at the restaurant. I was like, you buy the book, I'll make you something.
Some writers start bookstores.
Yeah, I would love to start a restaurant, and then I would never ever write again, and I would probably die a pauper.
Yeah.
But I would cook good, weird looking things.
So you have the nuts and bolts, hustle to order out experience.
I do, yeah. It's funny, it's such an anxiety provoking, like a sort of a high pressure atmosphere just to get people hot food that they ordered in a timely way. It's very strange. Like I remember this from working in restaurants, that we would get really stressed out in the kitchen trying to get the food out on time, because of course if you're in a restaurant, you order food, it takes a long time, it's not what you want, you get really crabby. I do. I expect my food to come out as I ordered it and in a timely fashion. So when you're on the other end of that and you're trying to work on a conveyor belt to make that happen, it can really induce some like schwitzing. And I worked like every kind of restaurant when I was growing up in New Jersey. I worked at a diner every summer as a high school student and as a college student to help pay my way in college. And then I also worked at a luncheonette in Montclair, New Jersey, where I grew up, which was 6 o'clock in the morning to 12 in the afternoon, and then it was closed. And we had a really abusive old-time waitress there who looked like Jamie Lee Curtis, and the customers loved her because she was so mean. So they would say things like, hey, can I please get some more coffee? And she'd be like, I only have 2 hands, get it yourself. So that was like the luncheonette. And then I worked in a French cafe for a while where I was a prep chef and had to wear a hat shaped like a garlic clove. And I kept slicing my hands all the time because nobody ever taught me how to cut anything properly, so I kind of had to learn on the job. And I was in the ER like 3 times in 1 year, and the doctor was like, maybe you should get an office job. And then I worked fine dining for a while. Also, I worked at the New French Cafe in Minneapolis as the manager for a while. Yeah.
When was that?
That was in I want to say 93, 94, when it sort of turned over its management. This was like a very, how to describe, like a very austere, very like upper quality, high quality French restaurant in downtown Minneapolis, where I put this in my first novel, Those Who Save Us. The walls were very plain, so nothing could compete with the food, and the food was this very lovely French fare. And that was the first time I saw a chef get really excited about a swordfish, like a swordfish that he had ordered. And we had a very, very handsome chef who everybody had crushes on, and he had eyes only for the swordfish. So that was where I learned to do a lot of things, like open a wine bottle without holding it between my knees and pulling out the cork, which I did once on the floor and got scolded for. So it was great. I mean, it was a great experience to do all this. I loved it. And I always would rather do that and keep writing than do office work, because that would interfere with writing. But while I'm cooking, I can think about writing in my head, as opposed to when I'm doing anything that involves my brain, I can't think about writing. So it's a nice symbiosis.
I haven't read the book, but it sounds like it has great bones for a future movie.
Oh, thanks. From your mouth to God's ears. That would be great. I would love that. Of course, I cast all the characters, so for all the books. And if I can't see who would play a character, then I know I haven't really visualized that character yet. So in addition to all my other images, I had actors or people I thought looked like the characters up on all my walls. And for Peter, I really wanted John Hamm to play Peter, but blonde. So I had images of John Hamm, Buster Crabbe, who was the guy who played Tarzan, in the 30s, I want to say like late 20s, early
Flash
30s.
Gordon, too.
Yeah, Flash Gordon, exactly.
Yeah.
So I thought Peter would look like Buster Crabbe. And also a little bit like George Papard from Breakfast at Tiffany's. So I had sort of an amalgam of people who would play him. And it was delightful to cast it and visualize it that way. But I was thinking of this book because it has this sort of three-ring structure and all these different eras. Maybe it's a commentary on what we watch now for entertainment, but for the first time, instead of thinking of the book as a feature film, I was thinking of it as like a series on Showtime or on HBO, so it would have the time expansion luxury of really getting into each character's experience as it rolled on, so maybe each one would get like 2 seasons or something, so that would be my hope. And I watch a lot of series now, and I've sort of forgotten about the art of movie making.
Have you written screenplays?
I did. I wrote the screenplay for Those Who Save Us, which is my first novel, which is actually under option and has been for many years while the producer tries to attach the talent and attach the director, and there are all these weird verbs involved with movie making, I discovered. But she, when she first bought the option for the book, she came to me with a screenplay that somebody else had written, and she said, "What do you think?" And she didn't have to do this. It was a total courtesy. But she is a lovely woman, and she wanted me to sign off on it, and I read it, and I was like, I always said this in the way that women argue, which is like with big smiles. I'm like, I really appreciate the effort, but I just don't think this is like the book I wrote in the slightest, and I'm wondering if you would give me a crack at it. And she finally said yes, and so I had to teach myself to write a screenplay, and I realized it's not my natural métier. Like, I really love being a novelist, because as a novelist, you're an autocrat. Like, the placement of every word, every punctuation mark, all of these rich details, I want to create mind pictures for you. And when you write a screenplay, you strip all of that down to the bare bones, and then you give it to a director and a team of actors and a cinematographer and a vast crew of people to build that picture up again visually. So I had to sort of cannibalize my own novel to write a screenplay, and it was amazing to do, and it was fun to learn something as an adult. But I realized, like, this is not my talent. So the producer is now working from a passable screenplay that I wrote, and I felt fine about that, because honestly, the way I taught myself to write one was I would read books that had been made into movies, and then I would read the screenplays of those movies, and then I would watch the movie with the screenplay on my lap and sort of follow it, page by page. There's so much deviation from the screenplay to the screen that I knew that when I was handing in a screenplay, I was just handing a basic recipe, and somebody else was going to bake something entirely. It would maybe be sort of the same, and sometimes they are totally the same, like Gone with the Wind is a great example of a great book that is a great movie. But a lot of the time, the recipe comes out a little different from what the screenwriters intended. So I made my peace with that. And I was like, go with God's screenplay. You know, maybe it will get made, and hopefully before I'm too old to go to the Oscars in a backless dress. Like that's my hope. So we'll see. You got another question, I think?
Would any of your high school teachers be surprised of your success?
No, because, and thank you, that's a nice question. No, because I failed every subject except English. I was totally uninterested in anything else except writing, and English was such a breeze. I was like, why do I need to learn how to dissect a frog? Like, we used to actually do this. I knew I was never going to dissect a frog. And I really didn't understand the need for geometry, and now it would be sort of nice to have a nodding acquaintance with math, but I'm like, that's why I have an accountant and facts. So I don't think so. I think that both my friends in high school and even my enemies in high school and my frenemies and my teachers would be like, oh yeah, this was the only thing she was ever going to do. And I was very dogged about it. I've been writing since I was 4. Because my dad was a writer, he was a news writer, as I think I mentioned, for CBS. So I grew up listening to his typewriter, and all I wanted to do my whole life was be a writer like my dad. So I started writing really young. And when I was in high school, this is probably a more direct answer to your question, I won 3rd prize when I was 14 in the 17 Magazine National Fiction Contest for a short story. And then 2 years later, when I was 16, I won the contest. My mom had sent in a short story that I had written behind my back because she knew that although I was churning out stories all the time, I was too lazy to actually market them. So she submitted the story to the magazine for me, and then it won the contest. And so I was like, oh, clearly the world owes me a living as a writer, you know. And it actually was like a big deal in high school because the story was in the magazine, my picture was in the magazine, and I went to the mall with my winnings and had a glamour shot photo taken that was in the magazine. So I had like this giant hair, you know, because it was the 80s. So I think that sort of cemented everybody's perception that I was going to be a writer. And ironically, I just missed my whatever reunion because I was at the Brattleboro Book Festival. But yeah, but they just had another high school reunion. It might be like 30 years. I don't even want to know. See, I'm still bad at math. Don't care. Yeah, I'm like, I was only 10 years ago that I was in high school, so.
That's right.
You know, the irony of Peter being fired because of his tattoo of the Count's number is kind of interesting, given the fact that almost every chef and restaurant worker has tattoos.
Yeah, like the sleeves.
It's almost like
right.
Can't get the job unless, you know, you have the full sleeve on.
Yeah, and lots of earrings. Yeah,
Exactly.
very like idiosyncratic looking people. That's true. It was one of the things I liked about restaurant work, and then returning to it in chef memoirs, and then sort of recreating Peter's kitchen crew. Actually, probably most of them have tattoos, and they're sort of an interesting melting pot the way most kitchens are. But one of my favorite characters in the book is actually a best supporting, she's not even a best supporting actor, but she would get like an Oscars nod somehow as like a cameo. Like maybe she would get best supporting because she's Peter's sous chef. She's a big Russian woman named Lena who's really butch and really mean, and she's so mean and so butch that actually like when they get newcomers in the kitchen, and they give her a lift, she throws them up against the wall and pretends to dry hump them, and nobody even knows at first that she is a woman because she's just like, nah. And Peter has been working with her for 15 years, and she has a very sharp tongue, and she swears a lot. You meet her like in the opening pages of the book, and then later she gives some advice about his love life, and like one of my favorite scenes in the novel, she doesn't pull any punches. And so she's sort of emblematic to me of the characters who you meet in kitchens, and especially the women who work in kitchens have like an extra axe to grind because it's hard to be a woman working in a kitchen and not be a pastry chef or like a prep chef. Like if you're actually a chef with chops, it's very unusual for a woman to be was sort of like king of the kitchen. So I was looking at Lena with great admiration, even though she says some really disgusting things. And tonight, actually, there's a chef in Boston who works at the Hotel Envoy, whose name is Chef Tatiana, and she's on Chopped Champions tonight, so competing for her chance to be like a Chopped champion. And I have such admiration for her that I was fantasizing about sending her a copy of the book and saying, I know from reading all of these memoirs how rare it is for a woman to even work as a head chef in a kitchen, let alone to attain this level. So it's very inspiring to me to see.
Never mind the abuse that's been levied at women.
Oh, yeah.
It's just come to light.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Here, too.
kitchens are like extremely saucy and misogynistic places anyway. So, yeah, it's not a place where you usually even expect the more politically correct niceties. Like, you just don't. I mean, you go into a kitchen, you know you're going to hear some shit, forgive me, library, but yeah, you know, and people will test you. They'll test you to see how much you can take.
Don't they all test, doesn't everybody test everybody? I mean, don't the higher-ups test everybody who comes in?
Yeah, but in
Yeah.
a really, in
If
the
it's
kitchens
women in
is
a
very
particular
blatant.
way,
In
yeah.
the kitchens is very blatant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to be able to get away with it sometimes because I was really cute and everybody would feed me, but you know, that was a role, and if you step out of that role, it's not always an accepted thing. So if I had wanted to work my way up and be a chef, I would have had to be one of the boys, probably, and you know, exercise my own Jersey vocabulary, which I may or may not have done a few times in my life. Do you ladies have a question? Not to put you on the spot or anything, I just wanted to make sure.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Oh, yeah. Actually, right now I'm on tour. So my writing life is very much like crop rotation, where I do one thing at a time. So I'm going to be on the road with Lost Family until about March.
Wow.
And like from now until December 16th, I'm actually traveling or speaking every single day. So that's, which I love. Like I love the speaking part. Like I love to connect with readers. That's so fun for me. But the traveling part is a little bit of a challenge. And then in January, it trickles off to like 3 or 4 events a month instead of 3 or 4 a week. So then I'm going to lock down in my study, probably here in Boston, and work on book 4. So to answer the question you actually asked me, it's the first time I've been able to answer this question at readings, because usually it takes me like 3 or 5 years to test drive the idea for a new book and find one that I'm really interested in, to spend a lot of time writing it and then to research it and to get to know the characters, do my master outline, you know, all of that stuff. The architecture, like all of it takes time. But for this next book, I already know the characters because it's another Peter Rashkin book, and it's a prequel sequel to The Lost Family. So it will be a standalone. So if you don't read Lost Family, although of course I highly recommend that you do, and I know you already are, even if you didn't, you could pick that book up and enjoy it. But it is going to explore Peter's family life in Berlin in the days when Hitler is coming to power and Germany is starting to not be itself anymore, because I wanted to explore how democracy crumbles and to personalize that. And then the other half of the book is set in the mid-2000s, and Peter, as a much older man, has a catalyst from his past to force him to go back to Germany to look at that past, and he finds out that nothing is the way he thought it was. So I'm actually super excited to get working on that book. And when I fly to events now, I'm carrying around a lot of really fun things, like when democracy dies, I'm like reading it on the plane, nobody will talk to me, or you know, when Hitler came to power, I'm holding it up like this. I was reading Legacy of Trauma on a plane, and there was a lady sitting next to me for a while who, this was on a flight to Kansas, and she was talking about that poor put upon Brett Kavanaugh and how unfair everybody was being to him, and I was like, and you're on a plane, it's an enclosed space, so basically I just took the Legacy of Trauma and I just went like this, and was reading it like this, and then it got really quiet on the next seat, so my reading material has come in very handy in my last couple of flights. Like I don't have to make like conversation with anybody.
Maybe the risk you run is that the person next to you is a trauma survivor, and they'll tell you all about it.
Actually, I would welcome it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would welcome welcome that. I had a driver from the airport to my event like 2 days ago who was a suicide attempt survivor. He told me about that. So you do sort of become a lightning rod for people's stories. With my first book, With Those Who Save Us, and with Lost Family to some degree, people tell me a lot about their family backgrounds with the Holocaust and what their families went through and how it affected them. And so my signing lines are slow because I don't believe that, you know, somebody's telling you the story that's really important, and I'm not like, well, how do you want me to sign this? Okay, thanks, bye. You know, so my signing lines take like forever. But it's such a privilege to be a recipient of these stories. So I can't wait to see what book 4 will pull up about democracy dying. Like, what stories do you guys have about that? So.
Well, if there's nothing else, thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Stuart.